Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about arguments for the existence of God, in particular the ontological argument, and this is in the AQA A-level Religious Studies specification. And I'm going to start with the ontological argument because it's the one that most students struggle with, and you may see why as we move through the video. So to begin, the ontological argument was proposed by Anselm, and it's an a priori and deductive argument. So a priori means that it attempts to prove through reason alone without reference to experience, and deductive means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion drawn should also be true. So it begins with a definition that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So therefore, by definition, God is the greatest possible being, because if there's nothing greater that can be conceived, then God logically has to be the greatest being. And for Anselm, this is therefore an analytical statement because it's true by definition. Now, Anselm's argument begins with the statement that it's greater to exist in reality, in re, than to exist in the mind alone, in intellectu. Now, it's good to remember the in re and in intellectu because I think it just up-levels your answers, and it also means that rather than having to continue writing in the mind alone, you can just put in intellectu or in re in your answers, so it just makes it a lot quicker as well when you're writing in time conditions. So, carrying on, we can conceive of God in our minds, so he must exist in intellectu. But if God only existed in the mind, then a greater being could be conceived. So it's cut off here slightly. Let me just move that out. Then a greater being could be conceived, one that exists in reality as well. So, to truly be the greatest conceivable being, God has to also exist in reality, because we can't have something greater than God, because that goes against our definition that we know. Anselm believes God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, I'd also state that you should remember that quote, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, because that is what Anselm directly said, so that's good to put in quotation marks within your essays. Okay, moving on. Therefore, finally, as a conclusion, God must exist. And to extend your answer, you can also talk about Anselm's view on atheists, because this argument can be condensed down quite a lot. So when you're writing a 10 marker, you just want as many ways as possible to extend the answer, because they have asked in the past just about the ontological argument and students have struggled to give that depth. So Anselm claims that atheists who deny God's existence are either misunderstanding the definition of God, or they're just saying the logically impossible. Sorry, that seems to have cut off, but there it is. So they're making a logically incoherent claim. So if they're misunderstanding the definition of God, they may believe that God isn't actually the greatest being, and that would be the only way that you could see that an atheist could be making a logical claim as to why God wouldn't therefore exist in reality. But obviously that goes against Anselm's definition of God, so that would be wrong in his view. Or they're just making a logically incoherent claim. They do have that definition of God being the greatest being, and they're therefore then going on to say God doesn't exist in reality, and that does not work. That's completely incoherent, so their argument fails in Anselm's view. So that could be your layout for the 10 marker, and I'm going to go on to evaluations and talk about how you could include one of these into your 10 marker, but obviously not as an evaluation. You would need to use it in an AO1 knowledge and understanding way, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. So a strength of the ontological argument is going back to my first point, that it's an a priori and deductive argument. And as we know, that means it's based on reasoning alone. And if the premises are true, for example, God is the greatest conceivable being, and it's greater to exist in reality than only in the mind, then the conclusion that God exists must also be true. So therefore, that is a very strong basis of Anselm's reasoning that God must exist in reality. However, and you can include this in the same paragraph as this first strength, just to build it slightly, is that Gaunilo criticizes Anselm's definition and argues that God cannot be defined as the greatest conceivable being. And the reason why is because he views that God is a transcendent being, so he's beyond human understanding, and that is a Christian view, as we know. So if we can't fully comprehend what the greatest being is, then we can't claim it's greater to exist in reality, because you can't even have an idea of God in your mind. So you can't go on to reason, as Anselm originally does. Therefore, the argument fails, as it relies on the assumption that we can understand something beyond us. However, a counter to this is that Gaunilo's objection may not actually be successful, because a complete understanding of God isn't necessary for Anselm. He believes that even with a limited understanding, we can grasp the concept of the greatest being. So, although we can't necessarily fully understand God's qualities, with our limited understanding, we can follow Anselm's reasonings and understand that God is the greatest being. So, the argument is still strong and persuasive. Now, I would personally put all of this in one paragraph, as I think it's quite good to be able to build and then again counter. However, obviously it's up to you. If you're looking for maybe a C, then obviously you could do these as 3 separate paragraphs, but they wouldn't be very developed, and it's better to then go on to counter them within the same paragraph, in my opinion. Okay, going on to your next paragraph could be that Gaunilo has another criticism, and he argues that Anselm's logic could be used to prove the existence of anything. So his reasoning could be applied to anything that we could conceive of, basically. For example, Gaunilo uses the idea of the perfect island, which he calls the lost island. And if this is the greatest island conceivable, then it would be greater to exist in reality than in the mind alone. So the island must exist in reality. This shows that Anselm's reasoning can be misapplied, making the argument logically weak. And you can see how this does weaken the argument, because if we can apply Anselm's reasoning to anything, and we know that clearly there isn't this lost island, then his reasoning seems quite incoherent and not very strong. However, Anselm does respond to this, and he argues that there needs to be a distinction between necessary and contingent beings. So Anselm replies that his argument only applies to necessary beings, such as God. This is because a perfect island is still contingent, meaning it depends on things like oceans, land, and time, because it exists within our world, within reality. So it could exist, but it could also not exist. However, God is necessary. He doesn't depend on anything for his existence, and this again is a Christian idea that we have seen. Therefore, only God can be defined as a being that must exist, and the argument cannot apply to islands or any other things. Therefore, although Gaunilo's lost island response shows how Anselm's logic could be misused and can be weakened, Anselm focuses on necessity, limits the argument, and therefore this is a very good defense against the lost island response. And this again can be used as a singular paragraph, because you've got your first point and then your counterpoint. And I know a lot of people would struggle maybe with timings in the exams, but I think if you just practice this and writing these paragraphs out, once you go into the exam, if you've got a question relating to this, you can just bang out those paragraphs really quick. Okay, finally is Kant's criticism of the ontological argument. And there's 2 parts of this argument, but it kind of comes together as one argument when put together. So you'll see what I mean. So the first point is that existence is not a predicate. Now, a predicate is a quality or characteristic that adds information about the subject. Anselm treats existence as a predicate. However, this isn't actually the case, and it's not how a predicate actually functions. And it's because it doesn't actually add anything new to the concept of God. And this is because we could, for example, imagine a perfect car in our mind. So your perfect dream car you are imagining. Now, if you then went on to see this in real life, Nothing about the car has changed. It's still the same car you imagined. It only now exists in real life. So existence doesn't change what the car is, just whether it exists. In the same way, saying God exists doesn't enhance the idea of God and add some greatness to God, as Anselm believes. It only tells us whether God exists, not what God is. Therefore, existence can't be used to prove God's greatness or necessity. So you couldn't then say that it's greater to exist in reality, because existence doesn't make God greater in any way. So this argument clearly is quite incoherent. Secondly, you can't define something into existence. So Kant also argues you can't prove something to exist just by defining it as existing. Anselm defines God as a necessary being, but this only shows what must be true if God exists, not that he actually does exist. For example, defining a unicorn as a horse with a horn that necessarily exists doesn't make unicorns real, and we know that. So defining God as that than which nothing greater can be perceived doesn't guarantee his existence in reality. It only tells us that if God were to exist, then God would be a necessary being. However, this doesn't prove that God exists in the first place. So although it is a logical definition of God, we can't say that it is evidence of his existence in any way. So then, in conclusion, Kant's criticisms undermine the logic of the ontological argument. If existence isn't a real predicate, and if we can't define things into reality, then Anselm's reasoning fails to demonstrate that God actually exists. Now, I'm going to go back and tell you how you can use one of these as an A01 point. So, going back to this argument of necessary and contingent beings, for your A01, you could go on to say, adding on to a paragraph or in another paragraph, that Anselm's argument only applies to necessary beings. And then you go on to basically say this response, not the whole argument. You don't need to talk about the perfect island, the lost orange response. Don't mention that. Don't try evaluate. All you need to say is that Anselm's argument only applies to necessary beings, and this is because, and then you would just say this part right here. You don't need to say any other part of this argument, and that would work as a good A01 point. I hope this has helped you understand the ontological argument a bit better, and I hope that it was clear and coherent, and thanks for watching.